My castaway this week is a musician. A graduate of the Guildhall School of Music, he began his career as a professional oboist, but soon moved from playing to producing. He joined EMI, where in 1962 he made a decision which was to change his and many other people's lives. He signed up a group called the Beatles and went on to produce every record they made until they disbanded 8 years later. The Beatles may no longer be in business, but my castaway certainly is. In the 25 years since, he's written the music for many films and produced recordings with performers as diverse as Sting, Jose Carreras and Stan Getz. Rock and roll, he says, has the same function as classical music, to make sounds that are appealing to a mass of people and are of some worth. He is Sir George Martin. How do you judge the worth of a piece of music, George? Surely it's a completely subjective business.
Oh, absolutely. Everyone's got their own ideas about what's good and bad.
But do you know, when you hear a piece of pop music, can you listen to it today and say, that's really good, that's good quality, or that's a load of old rubbish?
I can, but of course one of the problems of getting old is you get slightly less tolerant of bad stuff. So I don't honestly hear an awful lot of good stuff. I think technology's made things a bit worse too. It's a little bit too easy to make sounds now. I use synthesizers and computers as well as everybody else. And at my home, on a very small amount of apparatus, I can actually make orchestral sounds. I think that's terribly unfair. I don't think you should. Someone who spends their entire life learning how to play the oboe or the violin suddenly find themselves supplanted by a sampler.
But can you hear the difference?
Oh yes, of course they're not as good as the real thing, never are. But nevertheless, I mean, young people can use these sounds and cook up demos of music that is really very, very presentable, but doesn't have a great deal of intrinsic worth.
So when you were creating, shall we say, Sergeant Pepper, and John Lennon said he wanted to smell the sawdust, you went out and found a hurdy-gurdy or a steam organ. You had to have the real thing, is that what you're saying? And that although you could recreate it with a synthesizer today, it wouldn't be the same?
Well, in the case of Pepper, it's a different thing, because in fact that was synthesized stuff anyway, and my hurdy-gurdy sounds were, in fact, the forerunner of today's samplers, because all I was doing was taking existing recorded sounds and chopping them up and using them for my own purpose.
You disappoint me. I had you in my mind walking round fairgrounds looking for the right sound.
Well, do you know, I did that, and I really wanted to find a steam calliope, but it would have taken about 3 years to program the damn thing, so I gave up that idea.
So what was the difference between then and now, in that case, if you were actually reproducing sounds then, rather than getting the real thing?
I think probably the quality of the material, the song. If you're a classical composer, you've got to have a grand plan, but you've got to have the ability to write good themes and good contrapuntal work with those themes and good structures and form. Similarly, in rock and roll and pop music, you should have the ability to write a very good tune and great lyrics and put them together in a form that is very presentable. That isn't done now. If you listen to a rap record, you can hardly say they're great lyrics. And a lot of the tunes you hear are very, very tiny and very fragmented and rather monotonous.
Well, we expect nothing but quality music on this desert island, George, after all that. Tell me about the first record.
Well, the first record is by Ravel, Daphnis and Chloe. And I've chosen this because he could conjure up sounds with the orchestra better than anybody of his time. He was an impressionist in music. He painted a wonderful picture. If you listen to Daphnis and Chloe, in Shut Your Eyes, you will see a picture, and it's very beautiful.
part of Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe, played by the London Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Pierre Monteux. You must have told it a million times, George, but I've never heard it from your lips. So tell me about that morning in June 1962 when the Beatles walked into, what, Studio Number 3, Abbey Road?
Mm-hmm. Well, I brought them down from Liverpool because I wasn't too impressed with the tape Brian Epstein had played me. I said there was something there, but I couldn't find out whether it was worthwhile or not. I said I'd have to meet them and brought them down. And, of course, when I met them, I wasn't very impressed with their music still, and I couldn't really make out for myself what I was listening for, because I was so conditioned to a solo singer with a backing group that here I had 4 people who were all doing all sorts of things, and it wasn't Cliff Richard and the Shadows, that was for sure. But they did have tremendous charisma. They were the kind of people that, they still are, the kind of people that when you're with them, you are all the better for being with them. And when they leave you, you feel a loss.
So it was them that you fell for, rather than their sound in the beginning?
It was them. I fell in love with them. It's as simple as that.
But you must have heard something in that tape in order to invite them down, because other record producers had turned them down, hadn't they?
Every label in the country had turned them down. I think perhaps if I'd known that, I might have turned them down too, but I didn't.
There's a kind of destiny to it, though, isn't there? Because you were looking for a permanent recording star, as I understand. You were jealous of Cliff Richard and Norrie Paramore having him, weren't you?
Yes. Well, I had a hit record with Jim Dale. We had a number 2 record with a song called Be My Girl. And I'd had a previous number 1, but not with a rock group, with a group called the Temperance 7. And I always envied Norrie Paramore with Cliff Richard because it seemed much easier to make a record with a rock and roll artist than it did with comedy people. With comedy people, you had to find a great new piece of material every time. You know, if you were recording with Charlie Drake or Bernard Cribbins, the song itself had to be absolutely right. With a rock and roll star, it almost seemed, I mean, this is an exaggeration and not true, but it almost seemed that you give them God Save the Queen and you would make a hit record.
So they came into Number 3 studio, as we say, and they began to play. Did you know in that moment when you met them and you heard them and you put the whole thing together, did you think this could be the start of something big?
No. I did think that they had the potential to make a hit record if I could only find the right song. And I looked amongst all the stuff they had. The best I could find was Love Me Do, and we recorded that and we issued it. I knew it wasn't a number 1, but I thought it would have enough meat in it to call some attention to the group.
Record number 2, I think.
Well, it, of course, is the Beatles. And this is after we'd made our success, and they were appearing in Olympia, Paris, for the first time. And while they were there, I went over to make a recording with them in German, because the German market said they wouldn't be able to sell the Beatles unless they spoke their language, which the Beatles thought was absolutely ridiculous. But we sort of went along with the Germans, and I made them record this. So they recorded Sie liebt dich, ja, 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 and Komm, gib mir deine Hand. It was all rather silly, really. But during that time, the most amazing thing was that in the middle of it all, we had a call from America saying, your version of I Want to Hold Your Hand has hit number 1 in America. And for the first time, we knew we'd made it big.
But you mentioned that before then, before the Beatles, you'd been making these comedy records. Peter Sellers and Sophia Loren, I think, was your Goodness Gracious Me, wasn't it?
That's right, yes. I did most of Peter Sellers' stuff, all of it in those days. The recording with Sophia Loren came around because he was appearing in a film with her. And he fell madly in love with her, of course. although I don't think he ever got anywhere.
But he tried.
And Herbie Kretzmer and Dave Lee wrote a song which was related to the film they were making, The Millionaires, about an Indian doctor and a patient. And it was a terrific song. And I suggested it to both Peter and Sophia, and they went for it. We recorded it in Abbey Road No. 1, and I took it along to the film producer, and I said, this would make a great title song for your film, The Millionaires, He said, my dear chap, this is George Bernard Shaw. Can't play liberties with Shaw, So he didn't put it in the film. And, of course, when the film came out, everybody said, because by this time the record was a hit. Where's the record? And he actually had the good grace to admit afterwards he was wrong.
Oh, doctor, I'm in trouble.
Well, goodness gracious me.
For every time a certain man is standing next to me, a flash comes to my face and my pulse begins to race. It goes boom, boody, boom, boody, boom, boody, boom, boody, boom, boody, boom, boody, boom, 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 boody, boom, boody, boom, boody, boom.
Well, goodness gracious me. How often does this happen? When did the trouble start? You see, my stethoscope is bobbing to the throbbing of your heart.
What kind of man is he to create this allergy? It goes boom, boody, boom, boody, boom, boody, boom, boody, boom, boody, boom, boody, boom, 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 boody, boom, boody, boom, boody, boom.
Well, goodness gracious me.
And Right Said Fred was one of yours as well, wasn't it?
Yes, Bernard Cribbins, who is a dear friend and a marvellous performer of all sorts.
But, if ever anybody says, what does a record producer do, surely that's a brilliant example, isn't it? Because all of those sounds on there, the whole thing, the bringing together of the script in the first place and the right artist, and then all of the effects on it, it really, they sort of...
Yes. We had enormous fun doing those kind of things. I mean, that was really what I liked so much about making comedy records. Again, you see, it was painting pictures and sound. And it was a jolly good apprenticeship for what I did later with the Beatles, certainly.
And with Pepper, as you say, in particular.
Yes, indeed.
But why aren't there any of those records around anymore? We don't have them in the hit parade anymore. Are we so sophisticated that we don't like a good giggle?
Well, people don't have an oral imagination anymore. They like to see things. They don't like to hear things and imagine what they might be. So comedy records, per se, are bound to die. Videos would be a different thing. Comedy video. I mean, Monty Python and 40 Towers have supplanted Peter Sellers and all those early records.
Next piece of music. Oh, it isn't music.
Well, my next record is from Beyond the Fringe, which was one of my favourite comedy albums. I went up to Cambridge and recorded 5 nights with the group before they came to London. And we had a wonderful time. It was during that time that I learnt I had my first number 1 record with the Temple and Seven. So that's a kind of memory. And the recording that we had included this little excerpt, which I think is a send-up of the war, which really sums up the complete and utter futility of war. But it was so well done.
War's a psychological thing, Perkins.
Yes, sir.
Rather like a game of football.
Yes, sir.
You know how in a game of football 10 men often play better than 11?
Yes, sir.
Perkins, we're asking you to be that one man. I want you to lay down your life, Perkins.
Yes, sir.
We need a futile gesture at this stage. It'll raise the whole tone of the war.
Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, and that sketch from Beyond the Fringe. Let's wind backwards again, George Martin, because as I said at the beginning, your musical background was classical. You'd studied at the Guildhall and you played the oboe professionally in the LCC Parks, I read. Is that right?
Well, I wasn't good enough for the London Symphony Orchestra, that's for sure. And of course, it wasn't my main subject. I studied composition and conducting and orchestration at the college. And I took up the oboe, really, to earn a bit of a living. And I didn't earn a great one, but it did keep the wolf from the dog.
But you ran and played in and recorded, eventually, a Baroque group, didn't you?
I never actually played with the London Baroque Ensemble, which is the group that I recorded with Parlophone. It was run by a chap called Dr. Karl Haas, and he was a musicologist. And he would dig up old manuscripts of things and say we ought to record them, as well as stuff that was well known, like Mozart and Dvorak's serenades and so on.
And Peter Ustinov was involved as well, wasn't he?
Well, Peter Ustinov has a great knowledge of music, and he was very keen on the Baroque period and knew an awful lot about it, and was interested enough to become president of the London Baroque Society, a very grand title. We used to have little meetings. We used to have lunches or dinners with Harl Haas and Peter and myself, planning our repertoire and what we were going to record next. And it was then that I had the idea of recording Peter Ustinov doing his party piece of sort of mock operas, you know. And I made a record with him. It sold extraordinarily well.
So was that how you got into comedy records then? It was kind of led from the Baroque by Ustinov?
Well, kind of. I mean, with our little label, we had to compete against the big chaps, and, you know, with all the big stuff coming from America, like Frank Sinatra and Guy Mitchell and Frankie Lane and all those kind of people. And comedy seemed to be the outlet. And I wanted to make an album with Ustinov, but he was terribly difficult to pin down. And I had to look elsewhere for the album. And I found it in the shape of Peter Sellers, who, when I first met him, was really a stooge to Ted Ray with Razor Laugh. And the Goons came out of that. And we started making records together, I think, with Boiled Beef and Carrots, Harry Champion's song, and I'm Henry the Eighth I Am, and things like that.
It has been a hard day's night, and I have been working like a dog. It's been a hard day's night. I should be sleeping like a log. But when I get home to you, I find the things that you do will make me feel all right. You know I work all day to get you money to buy you things. And it's worth it just to hear you say you are going to give me everything. That's why I love to come home. 'Cause when I get you alone, you know I feel okay. When I'm home, everything seems to be right. When I'm home, feeling you, holding me tight, tight. It's been a hard day's night, and I've been working like a dog. It's been a hard day's night. I should be sleeping like a log. But when I get home to you, I find the things that you do will make me feel all right.
But you ended up as head of Parlophone at quite a young age, didn't you? 29?
When I was 29, yes. No one was more surprised than I when I was given the job. Sir Joe Lockwood was the head of EMI at that time, and he said he had been made manager at that same age, and he looked upon me to make Parlophone a great label. I think his confidence was, at that time, a little bit hyperbolic. I don't think he really believed it himself. But of course, in fact, with the Beatles, Parlophone did become a great label. And of course, we had Matt Monro as well.
There could never be a portrait of my love, for nobody could paint a dream. You will never see a portrait of my love, for miracles are never seen. Anyone who sees her soon forgets the Mona Lisa. It would take a Michelangelo, and he would need the glow of dawn that paints the sky above to try and paint a portrait of my love. It would take, I know, a Michelangelo, and he would need the glow of dawn that paints the sky above to try and paint a portrait of my
Record number 4.
My fourth choice is an oboe piece, and this is the Oboe Quartet by Mozart, and it's one of my favourite pieces, and it's the fast movement from it.
Part of the third movement of Mozart's quartet for oboe, violin, viola and cello K370, played by the Nash Ensemble. Let me wind the clock back even further, George Martin, and ask you about your life before you went to music school, because you might never have got there, as I understand it. Your parents couldn't afford music lessons for you, could they?
No, well, you see, it wasn't just a matter of not affording. I don't think my parents really ever thought that music could be a career. My father was a wonderful man, but he'd had a terrible time during the 30s depression. He was out of work for a long time, and I think that must have coloured his judgment. He wanted me to be a civil servant. My mother, on the other hand, knew that I was talented in drawing and in mathematics, and she thought I ought to be an architect. They both wanted me to have a safe job. And I never considered music as a career. I really wanted to be an aircraft designer. And music was a great hobby. And I had my own band, which I used to earn money from when I was 15 or 16. And I'd earned enough money to play for music lessons. And so I went to a piano.
So you paid for your own?
Yes. I wanted to learn Beethoven sonatas and Chopin and that kind of thing. And I had a few lessons there. But before I knew where I was in the war was still on, and I was in the Fleet Air Arm, and all music lessons had to go by the board.
But the family was pretty poor, I understand. You were brought up above the Sunlight Laundry in Highbury.
Not above the Sunlight Laundry, but certainly opposite it, yes, in Drayton Park in Holloway. Yes, we were poor, but we were very happy. I mean, my father was a carpenter, and I was sent to good schools, and I got scholarships and so on. And my mother was very hard-working, and she looked after my sister and myself extraordinarily well. It was a very happy childhood. I have very fond memories of my childhood.
And you went into the Fleet Air Arm, as you said, in the war, but after that you went into music school, which you didn't expect to do. There was a fairy godfather here, wasn't there?
Sidney Harrison, a marvellous man. He was a professor at the Guildhall, and I was introduced to him by another Harrison, who was not a relation, Eric Harrison, who heard me playing one of my compositions once and said I should send it to Sidney Harrison, who was on the committee for the promotion of new music. And I did this, and that began a correspondence which lasted right through the war. And when the war ended, I met him for the first time. And he said, "You really must take up music as a career." I said, "But how can I? I have no training." And he said, "You will get training. You will get a government grant. You will come to the Guildhall. You will play your compositions to the principal of the Guildhall, and he will be as impressed as I am, and you will get a 3-year course." And he was absolutely right. I did all of those things. And later on, it was as a result of Sidney Harrison that I was given the job at Abbey Road, EMI, because through another friend of his who was an opera producer, the word got round that they needed a young man to help in music production. And Sidney said, "I know just that fellow." So he was a marvellous man.
Record number 5.
I've always had a tremendous admiration for Benjamin Britten, and in my sort of formative years I would listen to most of the stuff he did, and his settings of folk songs I think were so imaginative and so super, and the most popular one of course is The Foggy Foggy Dew. In the days when he actually wrote that, it was considered rather risque, but of course it's very mild stuff now.
When I was a bachelor, I lived all alone and worked at the weaver's trade. And the only thing I ever did wrong was to woo a fair young maid. I wooed her in the winter time and in the summer too, and the only thing I ever did wrong was to keep her from the foggy, foggy dew. One night she came to my bedside when I lay fast asleep.
The Foggy Foggy Dew, sung by Peter Pears, accompanied by Benjamin Britten. How would it work with you and the Beatles, George? Would one of them come to you, John, say, with an idea for Strawberry Fields, or would they present as a group, or would he come along and have it completed, or, you know?
Well, we worked together for almost a decade, and the role changed somewhat. I mean, to begin with, I was the master and they were the pupils. At the end, I think I was the pupil and they were the masters. During the Pepper period, my function was to try and extract from them the maximum of their talent and try and find out what they wanted to hear. In the case of Paul, he was very articulate and always had a very good idea of what he wanted, and had very good ideas too. In John's case, he had marvellous ideas, but they were a little bit difficult to realise. He wasn't a very practical man. He couldn't change a fuse, and he certainly didn't know the instruments that could be used. So he would come to me and describe the sound that he would want, and I would then try and give him what he wanted.
But how would he have described Strawberry Fields, for example?
Well, in the case of Strawberry Fields, we started off with just the Beatles doing it. And then he came back to me and said, it's not quite what I imagined. He said, I'd like to do it again. Could you write a score? I'd like to use some low cellos and some brass, maybe some trumpets and things. So I said, okay. And I said, I'll spend some time with him. I talked through with him what we could do, and then went away and wrote a score. But in other cases, he would say, this to me is an orange sound, or something of that sort, you see. He would be very poetic, but not terribly accurate in his description.
But then you would deliver something and maybe he wouldn't like it, so you'd have to go and find a different way of doing it.
Absolutely. Well, in fact, before he died, I spent an evening with him in New York, and we were chatting about old times. And he came up with a remark which shook me. He said, I'd love to re-record everything. I said, John, you can't really mean that. Everything we've ever done, you'd like to re-record. Come on. He said, no, really, I mean it. And I said, what about Strawberry Fields? Oh, he said, especially Strawberry Fields. And I realised he was never really satisfied with anything he'd done, because his dream world was always better. Real life wasn't half as much fun.
And he was never really grateful to you, was he, for...
Oh, I wouldn't say that. John and I'm very fond of John. I think he was grateful, but he still... I think he always felt that things could be better. He never got them better. And he actually said to me afterwards, I wish you'd done such and such, when he worked with somebody else. So I think he was appreciative.
Was he jealous of your relationship with Paul, for example? You obviously had an easier relationship with him.
I don't think so. And I really wasn't aware that I was closer to Paul than to John.
But did you just work together with them, or did you spend a lot of social time with them as well?
Well, as much time as we could. I mean, I went on holiday with John once, and we went skiing together. But, they were so damn busy, and of course so was I, and it was difficult to find time together.
John Lennon on skis is quite a thought. Could he do it?
Well, in fact, it was the first time John had ever been skiing. It was when he was still with Sin, and we went to St. Moritz. It was jolly good fun, though.
Record number 6.
We have a chap who is the best guitar player in the world, I think, from a classical point of view, John Williams. And he plays a piece that I wrote. I wrote a suite for him of 3 pieces, which was really my attempt to sort of paint a picture of America. And this is the middle movement called Old Boston.
Part of Old Boston, played by John Williams and the Medici Quartet and composed by my castaway, George Martin. So you're a composer in your own right, George, and you conduct as well. You guest with the LSO.
Jack of all trades, master of none.
But you enjoy that?
Of course.
Of course. And you still work?
I'm afraid I'm still working, yes, and I don't intend to work quite so hard next year because there's so many things to do. You know, I do enjoy my life, and I want to spend a bit more time sailing boats and going places and building things. And
going to desert islands. Are you going to be all right when you get there?
I think so. I hope so. I do like islands. I've had lots of islands in my life. I built a recording studio on one, which wasn't a desert island, Montserrat, and we have a place on Alderney, which is the smallest of the Channel Islands, or one of the smallest. I like islands.
So you're going to be in your element in many ways?
Well, except for the fact that I don't like being by myself. I do actually enjoy the company of people.
You obviously don't work for the money. You don't need the money. You made enough, but not out of the Beatles, interestingly.
Well, no, I mean, the curious thing is that once the Beatles finished, I made far more money because people seemed to think that I had something to offer them. And
but you weren't on a cut with the Beatles, or you weren't on a percentage?
I was, but only after a time. When I left EMI, I was. Certainly when I worked for EMI, I wasn't. And when I left EMI, I managed to squeeze a tiny bit out of them, which actually paid for the building of the studios that we did.
But do you kick yourself that you didn't say to them in the beginning, look, give me 1%?
Oh, I've been awfully lucky. You can't look back and say you shouldn't have done that or you should have done that, You have to take it as a whole. And as a whole, I've had a wonderful life. I've met the most wonderful people, worked with the greatest of artists. I've been very fortunate. I've got no gripes at all.
I'm glad to hear it. Next piece of music.
I love George Gershwin, and I made a record of George Gershwin's songs last year, and Willard White, in fact, was on that record. But here we have him singing, I think, one of Gershwin's greatest works, Porgy and Bess, a marvellous opera. And here we have Bess, You Is My Woman Now, a beautiful aria.
Bess, you is my woman now. You is, and you must laugh and sing and dance for two instead of one. Want no wrinkle on your brow, no how, because the sorrow of the past is all done. Oh, Bess, my Bess, the real happiness is just begun.
Willard White singing Bess, You Is My Woman Now from Gershwin's Porgy and Bess with the Cleveland Orchestra conducted by Lorin Maazel. At least once a year the story is run that the Beatles are getting back together again. But it's kind of true this time, isn't it? Because the three have now recorded, I think, a backing track to a vocal that John left behind.
That's
Two,
right.
I think.
Yes, well, no, Yoko gave Paul a tape of John. It was just a demo tape. I mean, it's the kind of thing that where John would put a cassette on top of his piano and sing and play. And it was fairly crude stuff. But it did have John's voice on it, and it was also the beginnings of a song. And Paul and George and Ringo got together on it and contributed more material, more lyrics, and altered the song a little bit, added bass, drums, guitar, and voices, and it's absolutely marvellous.
Is it?
It really is terrific. When I heard it, I thought, I was a bit uneasy about it when I heard they were going to do it. But, of course, Paul said to me, it's the only way the Beatles can make a new record. And it's absolutely true. And the result is everything you would expect if John had been alive. They would have made this record.
It's that good, is it?
It is that
Although
good.
it began on a cassette tape on top of the piano.
Absolutely.
What
They've done a wonderful
technology
job.
has enhanced his...
They've had very good technical help, and I think it's superb.
What era do the songs come from?
Well, just before John died, he wrote Free as a Bird, about a year before, I think. And it lay in his store. He was something he was going to do something with at some time and never did.
And, of course, what it means, the fact that Yoko handed these tapes over to Paul, is that they are now reconciled, that this sort of protracted era of bitterness and argument between them has come to an end. What do you feel was the reason behind that? Do you think it was the difficulty of coming to terms with that sudden fame, with that everything? Do you think that it just has had a lasting effect on...
Well, it's a very complicated story. There have been so many differences, and of course money gets in the way of things. I think it was Groucho Marx who said that when money comes in the door, love goes innuendo. I think that there's bound to be differences when you have so much money involved, and it was more than that. It was a question of control too, and I think that now happily everything's been resolved.
Do you approve of calls for the three remaining Beatles to get together again on stage?
I think that if the right charity idea came along, they might be persuaded to get back together again. But they're not looking for it. I know that. They enjoyed working together in the studio very much, and they do enjoy each other's company. They really do love each other. But as for getting back on the stage, well, as a one-off it might be possible, but I don't see any more than that.
Perhaps they shouldn't. Perhaps they should just now leave it to history.
Well, we had such great times, and we have such a great past that I think it's an awful risk to spoil it.
last record.
Tchaikovsky's Romeo and Juliet Overture is one of the most beautiful pieces of love music, I think, that's ever been written. It's an outpouring of longing and frustration in music, and the love theme is, I think, extraordinary. It's quite inexplicable. You can't look at it and analyse the notes and say, how does it work? It just is enormous emotion.
Part of Tchaikovsky's overture to Romeo and Juliet, played by the London Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Hermann Scherchen. If you could only take one of those records, George.
One record? I think it's got to be Gershwin. I think it's got to be Best You Is My Woman Now.
So even you would leave the Beatles behind, would you, on a desert island?
Well, if you hear I Want to Hold Your Hand Every Day of Your Life on a desert island, I think you might get a bit bored with it after a while.
What about your book?
Well, I'd like a book on boats, because I think I'd like to build a boat and try and escape. And I'd like a book on design, if you like.
Well, you can study the design, you can build the boat, as long as you promise not to escape in it. I think that's what the rule is.
Okay.
And your luxury?
I think a musical instrument. I mean, if I've got a record player on the island, that means I've got some kind of electricity, doesn't it?
Yes, unless it's solar-powered, of course.
Right. Well, I think the solar panel might be able to charge my little synthesizer. I'll have an electric keyboard, which, if I could have a little computer that goes with it, even better. But certainly something I can make music on would be very nice indeed.
My feet are swinging, my head is spinning. You've got me dangling on a line. You keep me swinging all the time. Say yay or nay, dear, but either way, dear, please won't you make up your sweet mind. Don't keep me swinging all the time. Sometimes you smile, sometimes you frown. Oh, babe, I go up and down. My heart spins round and around. I'm walking on air, getting nowhere. Can't swing much longer, don't get no stronger, and only you can set me free. Just say take me or get you hence, but don't sit on that fence, 'cause my suspense is killing me. To love you can't be a crime, don't keep me swinging all the time.
It's delightful. I wish I could sing like that. But it's not everything singing, you know. It just isn't. I mean, the Bosch are no man's fool, let's face it. And the only important thing these days is, well, in my opinion at least, is rhythm and melody. Rhythm and melody is what the public want. And my Jove, they're going to get it as far as I'm concerned. My Jove, yes. Now, wait a minute, I've got my little ukulele here. Illustrate really fully what I mean. My feet are swinging, my head is spinning. You've got me dangling on a line. Oh yes, you've got me spinning all the time. It's not quite right yet, I grant you, but it'll come. It's a matter of practice, that's all. I'll come back on that in a moment, if I may.
George Martin, thank you very much indeed for letting us hear your Desert Island Discs.
Thank you.